Hello and welcome to the Believer's Lounge podcast. Thank you for joining us this week. Like usual, I am joined by my co-host, John. How are you doing today, John?
And as usual, I am doing great.
You're going to keep bringing that up, aren't you? Man, you can't just let me have this one.
No, I cannot.
Okay. Well, glad you're doing well. Today is a special episode as we have a special guest on for our topic this week. Today, we're joined by none other than Mr. Alec Timm. How are you doing today, Alec?
I'm doing great today, like John said. Nice, crisp Thanksgiving Saturday when we're recording. I was actually listening to the Thanksgiving episode on my way over. So there's a plug for that episode. If you're listening to this episode and haven't listened to that one, it's a good one. I did know the turkey thing.
Oh, very good, very good. Well, we appreciate it. So Alec Timm is a husband of 9 years, a father of 3, a youth pastor as well. He graduated from Emmanuel Bible College, which is also where I went and where we got acquainted. And he holds a Bachelor of Theology in Pastoral Ministry. And so we thank you for joining us today, Alec, in providing your comments and your insights. Our topic this week is a very interesting one. One that not a lot of people have talked about. I mean, in the podcast world, I guess you could say. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So let's have a good conversation.
So today, we're going to be talking about Christianity and pop culture. And we're going to look at a few different aspects of it. And essentially, this is just going to be a general overview on the topic. If this is something that you're interested in, feel free to let us know. You can always leave a comment or send us an email if there's anything in the episode that you find interesting or you have a different view on. We definitely would like to hear from you. So to begin our conversation, I just wanted to highlight the importance of good stories and what they teach us. Now, this kind of does segue into what we're going to be talking about, but to begin with, I wanted to talk about that. Why, and that's kind of our first question for you, Alec. Why are good stories important, essentially, to ask the question here? And how does that relate to Christians and pop culture in general?
Yeah, that's a great question, because good stories are a foundational part of human living. Stories go all the way back to the early days of recorded civilization. We have all sorts of examples of ancient stories. The oldest thing we have, for instance, the oldest piece of archaeological writing are, make sure that I'm correct. I'm going through my mental Rolodex. But the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is recorded on stone tablets. And that story, well, we're clearly missing a chunk in the middle, is the oldest manuscript, for lack of a better word, that we have. It's because it's carved into stone, obviously. And so even back in, pre-Indus Valley civilization, people thought it was important to keep track of stories. And if you've ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you already see part of the answer to that question. Because, of course, in the story of Gilgamesh, he tries for immortality and fails. He has a friend who he loves dearly who dies. He battles monsters and he tangles with gods. And there's all sorts of little moral lessons that are already slipped in there, kind of like when you were a kid and you didn't want to eat your vegetables, so your mom slipped them into your lasagna or whatever you were having. In the earliest example we have of mythology, there's those little nuggets of truth and wisdom sprinkled in. So when it comes to the Christian perspective, do we think stories are important? You get the impression from perhaps some people that they're not, but I would argue that Jesus does not agree, because Jesus himself used stories a lot. For example, can you think of any of those stories off the top of your head?
For sure. I mean, there's quite a few. If you're again alluding to a lot of the parables as they're called, that's right. And so there's a lot kind of jumbled into not only the four gospels, but I mean specific ones talking about really different themes, even to begin with, right? And so I can't really I know they're all on the top of my head right now. I can't really think of any, but it's really, I really do agree with your point there, how Jesus uses the stories that he does in order to illustrate kingdom principles. And yeah, no, for sure, that's what I wanted to mention. Yeah.
Well, here, I'll jump in for Michael's brain here. One of the probably the most prominent or well-known parables would be the parable of the oh, now my brain is blanking, of the prodigal son.
That's actually the one I was thinking of. Yeah. And if you ask the average person who maybe isn't a Christian or is perhaps of another faith or doesn't know much, they probably know of that Good Samaritan story or the prodigal son story. And that in and of itself tells you partly why Jesus used stories, because stories are memorable. If you sat down and tried to recall all of Jesus' teachings that you could, I guarantee you some of the first things you would remember are the prodigal son story, the Good Samaritan story, the man who built his house on the sand, the log and the speck, which is in essence a story, a humorous story. Or you, a reader, might remember stories about Jesus. You might remember stories about what he did or what he said. See, God has wired our brains for storytelling. Little kids tell stories very quickly. They don't always make sense and their plots are nonsensical, but so is much of the slop coming out of Hollywood these days. And unlike the movies that are made, my children don't waste millions of dollars with their nonsensical storytelling. But that's part of the human experience. That's something that God has given. And that's because, one, we remember them, so we're wired for stories. And secondly, stories are an easier way to process truth, to make truth relevant. And this is coming from someone who reads a lot of books. It's always better to pair a teaching or a principle with a story. I slug through my Greek philosophers and it's very boring, because the pure lessons that they're trying to teach are good lessons, but I'd rather watch Avatar: The Last Airbender and get basically the same heroic principle, but told in a much more interesting way. So when it comes to Christians and stories, Christians have a very rich tradition of storytelling. Every year I try to make sure I read at least one work by G.K. Chesterton, at least one work by Tolkien, and at least one work by C.S. Lewis. And those are just the obvious master craftsmen, the ones that everybody looks towards when we talk about Christians telling stories. But there are other examples. I'm going to plug it super early on because it never gets the love I think it deserves. A favorite piece of fiction by a Christian author that I really enjoy is called A Canticle for Leibowitz. It's written by Walter Miller M. Jr. And Canticle is a interesting story about a monastery that goes through a post-apocalyptic time and preserves information that would have otherwise been lost. And I picked that book up because I was trying to read all the inspirations for Fallout, because that's one of my favorite video games, and Tim Kaine plugged the novel. So I read it initially as a piece of, I want to see how this influenced a game that I love, but I really fell in love with it as a piece of Christian fiction. I actually didn't know that Miller was a convert when I started reading it, but it's so soaked into all the pages. So I know people know about Narnia, and I know people know about Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, and probably some of Lewis's other work, like the Space Trilogy. If you've never read that, highly, highly recommend it. Or Screw Tape Letters, Till We Have Faces. People know about that, but not a lot of people have heard of A Canticle for Leibowitz. So that's why I always jump in both feet first when I'm talking about Christian fiction and say, if you haven't heard of this one, I highly recommend it.
Well, we appreciate new material as well. And just to go based off of off your points there, I think that's really applicable and practical for us. And it not only today, but it transcends, generations. We've kind of grown up. People have, from back in the past, have, we've grown and we've been influenced by storytelling and then the principles that have come through them. And so it's definitely, one could argue, part of the human nature, essentially. And so by as Christians, we definitely see that the Bible is a collection of, not only information, but it's a collection of many books with poetic literature, with apocalyptic, revelational literature, but then also stories, like you were mentioning, stories about biblical principles, about kingdom principles, and so much more. And so, not just looking at the Bible, but other literature as well, we do see how we have essentially an example when we read literature about principles, whether those are Christian principles from the Bible or just a favorite story or such. Like I am a huge Tolkien fan, to say it lightly, and so I've yes, thank you, I appreciate it. I have read the Silmarillion from front to back probably 6 times now, and
I love the Silmarillion.
I can't say enough about it, to be honest. I have discovered something new or made connections either to the whole Middle Earth story or other principles that Tolkien's talking about that relate to us practically in our life. I've been introduced to something new every single time I've read it. And I don't get that with a whole lot of literature. Now, again, this is kind of deviating from our point, but I just wanted to ask you, Alec, is there material, again, on the topic on our topic here, that you've reread and have picked up new principles or new information And again, the second part of that question is that relevant for just more than reading the Bible? Is it something that we should practice in our literature or our reading life, I should say?
Yeah, 100%. And I don't think this is purely just about literature either. There are movies and games and comics that I've experienced more than once. I think, first of all, something that Pastor Ethan, who is the senior pastor here at EBC, that's where I went to college, at HPBC, where I now work, we've talked about this. There is a consumer mentality right now when it comes to even stories. There's lots of discussion about, well, at least I'm enjoying something new. At least I have a new thing to watch. The streaming wars have exacerbated that fact, but it was always kind of there. I'm someone who enjoys the weird fiction, the sword and sorcery kind of genre as well. Robert A. Howard, Conan, and Poul Anderson, and guys like that. And so there were always dozens and dozens of these books that used to be sold for a dime back in the day, believe it or not. So there has always been that drive for new, but we've taken it to kind of an extreme where the idea of going back and re-enjoying a piece of media seems almost foreign. But you've talked about that, and I can use a Lord of the Rings example for this. I have not read the Silmarillion 6 times, which it's on my agenda. It was phenomenal work. But the first time after I read the Silmarillion, and I really understood that Gandalf is an angel, because the Silmarillion makes it clear this is the proto-history of our own world, because Tolkien very famously wanted to create a mythology for the Anglo-Saxons who didn't really have their own mythology. And so Lord of the Rings is supposed to fit into our own history. And that includes our own spiritual history, our own Christian history, because that was very important to Tolkien. Tolkien loved the Bible. He loved Christ. He loved God. This is a man who has stated on the record that the Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally Catholic work, in his words, subconsciously at first, but consciously in revision. And I think that's important to stand our principles on, particularly in a day and age where there's an attempt to act like Tolkien was not writing a piece of Christian fiction, which he was. But when you go through the Lord of the Rings, again, with this knowledge that Gandalf is an angel. He's an angel like Gabriel or Michael, or because Tolkien was Catholic, it's a little bit more comparable to Raphael in the Book of Tobit. But still, it really changes your perspective on what he says and what he does. And I told Jazzy this because I thought it was really cool. Jazzy's my wife. I realized I didn't clarify that. When we were watching this year for, I don't know, the umpteenth time, we're rewatching Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films, the extended edition, of course, because I love Tolkien. I don't hate him. So we're rewatching this film for the first time in, again, probably 4 or 5 years. I think since Victoria, my oldest, was born. And this is the first time I'm watching it with the knowledge in my mind that Gandalf is not just some old guy. He's an angel. And some of his scenes with Pippin or with Aragorn or with a lot of these other moments, they change your reflection. I think every time I watch the Peter Jackson movies, I appreciate a different character more. And Peter Jackson did a great job. I know it wasn't perfect, but he did a really good job because he really loved Tolkien in trying to put those characters, put those truths onto the screen. He used so much of Tolkien's own literature. He used so much of Tolkien's own words. He used so much of Tolkien's own writing. And so every time I watch the Lord of the Rings movies, or every time I read the books, I learn something new. So I'd say Tolkien is the obvious example, but to pivot away from him, I'm also a big fan of, this is going to sound horrendously pretentious, but I promise it's how I really feel. I really love Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. I have 2 or 3 translations. I have 3 translations of Inferno, and I have 2 translations of the whole thing. One's a thought for thought, and one's a word for word, which, as a brief aside, let me tell you, reading fiction that's been translated from another language really makes you think about and appreciate Bible
for sure,
translation a
exactly.
whole lot more. And that's a story that I've read a couple of times, and every time I read it, I gain some kind of new thought, some kind of new insight. It just drives me closer to the glory of God. But that's, again, explicitly Christian fiction. There's lots of non-Christian fiction that includes lots of Christian principles. Since it's October, we were watching as a family Nightmare Before Christmas, the old Tim Burton stop motion. Have you? I assume you've seen Nightmare Before Christmas.
For sure.
John, you've seen Nightmare Before Christmas,
Actually,
right?
that is on my list of things to watch.
Okay. Nightmare Before Christmas is a fascinating movie from a Christian perspective because Tim Burton is not a believer, as far as I'm aware, but he tells this story that is got lots of layers of the journey to salvation, because Jack Skellington, kind of the main character, he's the one who he gets the meaning of Christmas. He doesn't fully understand it, but it impacts his heart, kind of like the parable of the sower. And he tries to bring it to his friends. He tries to make them understand this principle, but he can't. And they can't get it either. They get it all wrong. But in the end, of course, it's Santa who has to bring Christmas, not Jack. And in a very similar way, some of us, we can get the message of salvation. It can penetrate our hearts and our minds, and it can change the way we go. And we go, oh, I understand. And you try to share it with your friends, and they just don't get it. And you try to make them get it, and they mumble it up, and they get it wrong, and everything comes out wrong, because we can't ultimately bring someone into a saving knowledge of Christ. Only the Holy Spirit does that. And so that's a great example as well of seeing Christian principle in non-Christian work, particularly with Nightmare Before Christmas. I don't think that was intended.
But it's a good example that these principles can be grasped and can be taken from different variations of works, whether that be a different media type, such as a movie or literature, or even the intended demographic, the publication date. Like it kind of transcends all that, and so it's definitely a good example, and we appreciate your comments on that for sure. Now, again, just going still on this topic, another point I wanted to get to was in the realm of, well, we can continue talking on the topic of stories, or we can look at more of the viewpoint of the current popular culture. I'll let you kind of take this away from whatever viewpoint you'd like. But I wanted to talk about Christians not overreacting to things in culture that do support them. I want to take a look at that angle. And for sure,
I'd love to talk about that angle. Well, for many years, I kicked around in the back of my brain the idea of writing an article called Dungeons and Dragons and Doom and Christians. I liked how that sounded, but I never had anywhere to publish it, and I've got 8 billion other things I should write anyway, and I am a full-time youth pastor and father and a husband, so writing pretentious articles is pretty low down the list of things I should be doing. But you do raise this excellent point that Christians do have a bit of a habit of overreacting to things that are actually in their favor. Harry Potter is a very, very famous example of this, where there was a lot of Christian parental
quite a bit,
hysteria
and for a
around
while
Harry
too.
Potter. Oh
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
you'll still find it in some circles, but most people have now come to recognize the fact that, I mean, Rowling was a nominal Anglican and still is, as far as I'm aware. And there's a lot of extremely powerful Christian themes within Harry Potter, to the point I remember seeing an article years ago from, I think it was The Atlantic or one of those newspapers, decrying the rise of Christian propaganda, which included references to Harry Potter. Now, I don't know if it was from The Atlantic, so if anyone from The Atlantic is listening, don't sue me. It was just from a paper like that. And if you read the books in particular, the movies do an all right job. Unlike the Lord of the Rings trilogy, there's a wild range in quality from Harry Potter movie to Harry Potter movie. But if you read the books, you really get a lot of Christian principle within those books. You get a lot of push towards heroic self-sacrifice, love for one another. Harry himself is kind of a bit of a Christ-like figure with his, quote-unquote death and resurrection. The battle of good versus evil. Anytime you have a story that is about the battle of good versus evil, which all good stories are to a degree, you are telling the real story in some way. I'm before I pivot back to Christian overreacting, this naturally segues into something I did want to bring up, which is something Tolkien talked about. Tolkien called Christianity the only true myth. And sometimes people misunderstand what Tolkien meant when he called Christianity a myth, but he was speaking in the old language where a myth was an epic story. And Tolkien called Christianity the only true epic story, in essence. And he saw Christ's conquest over evil and death as the ultimate tale. It was the ultimate glorious story, made all the more better by the fact that it was true. And he wrote this poem, Mythopoeia, which was actually dedicated to C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist at that time, about the importance of these stories and telling them. And so anytime you enjoy a story where good triumphs over evil, you are enjoying that in part because it is a reflection of the true story. It is a reflection of truest reality. And reflections of truest reality are beautiful, and they are themselves worthy. But segueing back into that original point about Christian overreacting, yeah, Harry Potter is a great example of that. One that is near and dear to my heart, because I have been in that space for a very long time, is Dungeons and Dragons. I've been a DM, a dungeon master, for longer than I've been a pastor. And I've been a pastor for I've been a pastor for, it'll be 4 years now in November, which is mind-boggling to me how that time has passed. But that's one of my true passions is D&D and tabletop role-playing games in general. And that was a famously demonized, famously misunderstood avenue of expression. It's a game, but it's a game that lets you tell heroic stories or fantasy stories or fun stories, or it interacts with your friends on a personal basis. It encourages mathematics, which I desperately needed encouragement with. I will tell you that for free. It encourages interactions with other people, particularly in an increasingly digital age. And Christians didn't understand it. A couple of prominent Christians didn't understand it, and so instantly demonized it. And I think that was real tragic. You still see that. That's one. Even more than Harry Potter, you will still see that today. And I think that's tragic, because it's a time where, looking back, we appear kind of foolish for how we reacted to something like that. But it's also a wonderful tool for storytelling and taking part in the heroic tradition of good triumphing over evil and stuff like that. I'm trying to think, can you think of any examples yourselves? I'm drawing a little bit of a blank here that are similar to that you can think of.
It's a good question. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. How about you, John?
No, I'm drawing a blank as well. The one that kind of that I think of, I've never actually seen the movie myself, probably because of the backlash, was the movie The Golden Compass. I remember a lot of backlash from that, and I still haven't watched it.
That's an interesting case. I read the first book in that series, and that was a guy who was trying to be anti-Lewis. He was an atheist. I can't remember who wrote The Golden Compass. I'm actually drawing a blank on that, but he was in essence trying to tell an anti-Narnia story, which is partly why all those franchises fizzled out, because as we've talked about, the stories that matter are parallels of the true story. And that's why all the series that we love that get so big, whether that be Star Wars or Star Trek or Avatar: The Last Airbender, which I've talked about before because I love it, or Lord of the Rings, obviously, last and make an impact because those principles are universal and those themes are timeless. That's kind of why Tolkien will outlast Martin in the historically. That's why Tolkien will outlast Martin in the long run, and why you're already kind of seeing it. That's why we still talk about people like Lewis or Chesterton, or even guys like Howard or Jack Vance, or some of those guys who maybe are not to the level of Tolkien or Chesterton or Lewis, but whose stories are still fun and memorable. So Compass is an interesting chase. I don't think we need to be scared of any piece of fiction. I think we can recognize that stories can't hurt us, but they also do have an impact. And you need to be consuming your media consciously. You need to be aware of what the principles of the media are trying to say. I think that all stories, to some degree, have a meaning and they have a purpose, even very, very dumb or very, very simple stories. There's nothing wrong with enjoying a dumb or a simple story from time to time, but it is important to think about, what does this mean? What does it say? And in best case, it elevates it. I enjoy the stories that I enjoy more because of the themes that they contain. And at worst, it makes you go, okay, maybe this isn't one to revisit.
For sure. That is very very important to consider, right? Like, definitely, there's a lot of takeaways we can get from however we from our content that we consume, but we definitely have to be very conscious about that. And now, kind of focusing a little bit more on that from a Christian perspective, and this kind of ties into this, where we see alluded to a lot of the time in Scripture that as Christians, we're called to be separate from the world, and that's alluded to a lot in Scripture and in what Jesus was communicating. Now, focusing on our conversation here, how would you respond to the people who kind of have that angle from on that? Like, okay, well, what you're saying makes sense, but aren't we called to not consume non-Christian content? Aren't we called to be separate from that? How would you respond to someone who would kind of go from that angle?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great topic. And as someone who grew up homeschooled, I can tell you, I knew a lot of people like that. Yeah, if it's not Adventures in Odyssey, I don't want it, kind of thing. I would talk about a couple of principles. I think when it comes to media consumption, it is important to recognize the meat sacrifice to idols principle that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians. Yes, 2 Corinthians. If it's 1 Corinthians, I'm going to be so embarrassed. But if you remember in one of the Corinthians letters, Paul talks about whether or not you should eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols. And he talks about if you are a person who is of clean conscience and you realize that idols are not real and you're not sure, just go ahead. And nobody's going to misconstrue what you think. Just go ahead and eat. But if you're not, out of homage to the weaker brother, out of respect to the weaker brother, we honor their limitations. And I think when it comes to media consumption, that should be the underlying principle that as Christians, and that's the first thing that should separate us from each other, is there are things I enjoy with a clean conscience that I know many people wouldn't. And I'm not going to force them into that, say, well, you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that. So that should be our first underlying principle. However, moving the step above that principle, I think we need to recognize that all truth is God's truth. And all good stories that, whether they are made by Christians or not, that contain truth will point back in some way to Christ. Even if that is just the struggle of good versus evil and the triumph of good, which is a basic storytelling beat that goes back to Gilgamesh, we see that there. So I think we can see value in those things. We can see the good in them. What does it mean to be in the world but not of it? I think part of it means we can enjoy these stories. That is being in the world, is saying this particular game or this particular movie, I like this message. I like what it says. I agree with what it says. I don't agree with everything it says, but I recognize the value in it is part of that. But also to be not of the world ties back to something I said earlier about mindless consumerism. I think a Christian shouldn't just watch something because it's on or just play something because it's there. I think every Christian should take at least a few seconds. You don't have to give a deep dive and write me a paper, but at least a few seconds about, is this something that's worth my time? Or is this something that is edifying? And I'm not always the best at doing this, I fully confess, but I think that is a key piece of the principle for your own self, for your own standing before Christ, is to think about it first. Because being of the world is just being of the world's vices. That includes mindless consumption. That includes the fact that there is lots of garbage that is pumped out. Some of it is now wearing faces that belong to the virtuous, that they're undercutting with garbage.
That's right.
We've alluded to that a little. We Rings of Power. Fight me, Jeff Bezos. I hope you
Not
come to my house and fight me.
Yeah.
No. So I do think if you're dealing with somebody who is really not comfortable, that's why I don't talk as much about Dungeons and Dragons in particular as I would like. That's why it is not something that I'm as open with as I would like, because I know for some people they still really struggle with that. Or they have a misconception about that I will never change, and it will affect how they think about Christ and how they will think about God. So I just let it be, and that is something I do out of respect for other brothers and sisters. So that is the foundational principle. The meat set. I taught this to the youth 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we actually dealt on that whole point of, is it in Romans actually? It might be in Romans actually. He talks about it more than once. He does talk about it in Rome. Paul talks about it in Romans because it was a Roman study. So I know it's also one of the Corinthians, but I'll use the one from Romans. I'm so bad with references. Somebody from my church is going to hear this and they're going to think I've never read my Bible. But that principle is so important when it comes to media. And I taught about that with the youth. that is a textbook modern example of how do we as Christians approach popular culture and approach one another in brotherly and sisterly love. Are we putting others above ourselves? Are we recognizing others above ourselves, their needs as greater than our own? But if you're in the kind of conversation where somebody is genuinely interested in potentially reaching out about something, or they're not sure, or they want to have a discussion with you about, well, should Christians partake in non-Christian media, non-Christian pop culture, I would say take it on an item by item and a case by case basis, because there is lots of great stuff out there that is edifying, that teaches good lessons for your children, for yourself. I mean, I'm going to definitely come off as a parent in the year of our Lord 2024, but I don't know how I would function without Bluey. My kids love it. I love it, and it's full of edifying stuff about being a parent and about talking to your children, and it's so valuable that I would hate to be without it, and I can endorse it wholeheartedly. But I think that's the most important to kind of wrap up your point is recognize the principle of the meat. So what might be appropriate for you, or what you might recognize in your heart is good for you, isn't necessarily good for everyone else. So put their needs above your own, and recognize the fact that all truth is God's truth, because God is the Father of truth. So anything that is non-Christian that is worth your time will still have true elements in it, regardless of what that looks like. And 3, take everything kind of on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, it's a little more work, but it's better for you in the long run. And you're never going to catch up on everything. My Steam backlog is full. I have DVDs that I haven't seen. I've got books I haven't read. So in the time it takes for you to make sure that something is edifying, don't worry. You'll never get through all the stories that you do have anyway, and they're pumping them out faster than we can keep up with them. So taking the extra couple of minutes to make sure that what you're going to consume is something that's worthwhile is in itself worthwhile. Does that answer your question, or do you want some more clarification?
That answers
on
my
that?
question for sure, and I would agree that we really do have to take things by a case by case basis, and definitely be in prayer about that as well, because the Lord will direct us, and he will reveal things, and he does reveal things to us through the Holy Spirit. And so it's real easy to talk about any subject really that man could think about, and kind of create its own little box, and pick apart at that and examine that. And there's nothing wrong, but again, just understanding, and this is not another point, this is going off base what you were talking about, is just understanding as well that God's influence and his direction transcends all of that. And so through this topic, through many more, as Christians, we understand and we realize that God will guide us to these principles. He will, we will, if we're spiritually mature, we will hopefully have that discernment as to what material is appropriate and not to consume. And so, yeah, these are just added notes here to what you were saying. But yeah, no, I appreciate your comments on that for sure. Anything to add on your end there, John?
Yeah, there's always that aspect of trying, I'm not a parent, but I can take a lesson from what my parents have done with almost a censorship of movies, where as kids we were told no Aladdin, no Lion King because it introduces death too soon. trying to protect your children from certain movies, certain books, it's almost a fine line to walk from condemning a book or a movie or a genre, not forcing or almost driving your kids to watch it. I'd say there's got to be that communication where you say, okay, you watched it, or you're gonna end up watching it anyways. We're gonna talk about it and have that open discussion. And I think that would bring much more value and much more insight into certain types of media that would probably go both ways between a child and a parent.
Yeah, 100%. It is important to talk about these things, and it's important to recognize that every child is different. But when it comes to children's media, there are two quotes that I think are so important. One's from Lewis and one's from Chesterton. Chesterton was the one who said, fairy tales don't make children believe in dragons. Children already believe in dragons. Fairy tales make children understand that dragons can be slain. And C.S. Lewis, of course, very famously said, since children will so soon hear of evil terrors and villainy, something to that effect, he said, let them also hear tales of heroic knights and brave courage. I wish I had the quote printed out in front of me. We also kind of put things in that perspective. Children need those stories of triumph. Since they will come across dastardly dragons so soon, it is so important for them to recognize that they can be overcome. And that's what good stories do.
So our scripture verse for today is Psalm 103, 11 to 15. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his steadfast love towards those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. For he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. As for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field. Well, thank you for joining us for this episode again. Just want to say thank you again, Alec, for coming on and offering your comments and your insights. We really appreciate having you on.
It was an absolute pleasure and an honor. Thank you for having me on. I love the podcast, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of it. So thank you.
Thank you as well. Thank you. And we look forward to our continuing on in our next episode. And so we will all see you next time. Take care.